Welcome back to my NFL 2022 Exit Report series. Today's team is the New Orleans Saints, and I'm proud to have a new guest on the show, Jared Smith. And he's been very active, at least during the football season, and maybe a little bit more. We talked off camera about all the different things he's up to, betting analyst, Fox Sports, VSiN, and so on. Jared, how are you doing?
Oh, Ron, I'm so great. I'll be honest, the football season happens and it's like a blink. And then it seems like we're already prepping for the next one before we can even have a post-mortem. But that's why I love stuff like this, because it's more open and more long form where we can talk through some of these, let's call it fascinating topics with some of these teams as we head into the offseason.
Yeah, and each one has a different story, and it's quite interesting because I've never kind of done it in podcast form before. I've always kind of written about it while it's fresh in our minds, but to share it and to share my thoughts verbally and to get your thoughts as well, it really helps not only put a wrap on the last season, but we've got to move forward. We've got the draft coming up. We've got free agency in about a week or so, and then after that, it's the schedule is out, the season's going, and we're back at it again. So it's, football's nonstop if you want to stay ahead of the game. And the Saints, and I'm glad you're doing this one with me with the Saints, because I've done some solo shows. The Saints were perplexing to me all last off season. They lose Sean Payton. They bring in Dennis Allen, which I supported at the time. He was with the Raiders. That can be dysfunctional. He's learned a lot. He's a great defensive mind. But now he's in that main seat in an offensive-minded league. If you can think back to 12 months ago, February at this time, Dennis Allen is the head coach. What were your thoughts?
Well, I think the first thought, anytime a team goes from an offensive-minded head coach to a defensive-minded head coach, it obviously changes the way that, I guess, the tip of the brain interprets every situation. And when you look at what Dennis Allen did this year, it kind of makes sense, because I would say Sean Payton a little more aggressively minded. And then when you go to Dennis Allen, the first thought was, okay, how is the offense going to respond? Obviously, because that's the biggest shift inside the building. You had an offensive-minded head coach who's calling the plays for the most part. And now all of a sudden you kind of siphon off those responsibilities to a different part of the building, whereas now the head coaching room is a little bit more on the defensive side. And I think the one thing I've noticed, if I was starting a team today and I had to pick a head coach, offense or defensive minded, I would absolutely go with offense. I just think overall it hampers the aggression that each team has, knowing that you are solely responsible and you're kind of, staking your reputation on the defense. Whereas an offensive-minded head coach, we've seen it with Nick Sirianni, with other, more modern coaches, they are full pedal down to the metal. And that has been a very interesting approach. And the one thing that stood out to me, too, with Dennis Allen this year, the fewest fourth down attempts of any team in the NFL. So not only was our kind of, feeling on him right, because he wasn't a very aggressive head coach, but it was a very defensive-minded scheme. And I think that translates to maybe some of those moments during the game where a coach might be a little more aggressive and might take that chance. Well, the Saints didn't do that. And I think that was kind of my first thought when they made that shift.
What an excellent point. Fewest fourth down, attempts, conversions, and so on, because this is an analytical driven league. The shift has been noticeable the last 2-3 years. Even the announcers are talking about it. And the rules still favor offense because the league wants higher scoring. So when you have these defensive-minded coaches, they have to be maybe a little bit better than just average to make do in this NFL. And now he comes in. He knows the Saints well, so he knows the defense, and it's a veteran team. This is a team typically, which irks me to no end, they draft 5 players a year. And I don't know how you can get away with it. And the Saints got away with it for a long time, just couldn't get to the championship game, couldn't get to the Super Bowl. Yeah. And they draft, pretty effective players. In fact, Chris Olave from this past year, very effective. And they added some late guys, too, that were very interesting, homegrown guys. LSU's Jarvis Landry and, the anticipator, as I call him on defense, Tyrann Mathieu. So they had some pieces there, and it was looking interesting as we headed into the season. How did you feel? Any special thoughts about who they added in free agency in the draft as we headed into 2022?
I thought they drafted well at the top. I agree about the volume. When I was analyzing their rookie class, a couple things popped out. First of all, Chris Olave, was in consideration for Rookie of the Year. I think he has a very high upside, and I think it's going to allow them to get rid of Michael Thomas this offseason. And, he's going to be a cap casualty, I think. And I think that transition was obvious to me that they needed a reload at wide receiver, but they actually had a second first-round pick that they used on an offensive tackle who also had a really good year once he overcame a bit of an injury issue. Missed about the first half of the season, but Trevor Penning, fantastic, one of the best tackles in the draft from Northern Iowa. And I thought, again, those two players were the highest graded rookies on the Saints roster this year. But the one thing, again, when you dig into what the Saints have done, you mentioned it at the top, the volume of players that they've drafted. Well, they actually had the 7th fewest snaps from rookies last season. So despite the fact that I think at the top of the draft, I was very impressed with the Olave-Penning combination, injuries aside, not a lot else outside of that. So I think depth, and when you look at their roster construction this offseason, it does seem like a makeover is in order where you need a little bit more volume of youth coming into this system, because right now, again, defensive-minded head coach, most of their big free agents are on the defensive side. That's not today's NFL. That's not how you win. So I think that organizational shift is something that I'd like to see. We started to see it last year, right? They drafted 2 offensive players in the first round. I think that's something that's going to have to continue for the Saints this offseason.
Yep. And we're going to revisit some of the players as we walk through the Saints in 2022, but you're absolutely right. And this is an organization, the best thing I can say is compared to the rest of the league, they tended to avoid injuries more than others, and they need to, because it really matters. The Rams are like that. The Saints are like that. The difference between your first stringers and your second stringers due to draft volume, etc., not so good. This point of the, I like to go over what I put on my August team sheets. I have a very large piece of paper, 8.5 by 14, the legal size for each team.
I'd love to see those. I bet that's a great catalog.
Yeah, there we go. It's blank in July. It's filled in August.
Wow.
The season's over. This is what it looks like.
That's awesome.
And it's got my keys way at the bottom. And I'm going to read them off. And then after I read them off, any keys that you would add or anything you want to say about them. And some of it with the Saints is really what we've already been talking about. Pace of offensive play. The league is no longer run, pass. And I worried about that with Dennis Allen. I worried about quick snaps, no huddles, that they wouldn't be doing that. I worried that would slow them down. They would be in a completely different rhythm than with their previous coach, Sean Payton. Second key here was the run game concern. At the time I wrote this, I didn't know whether Alvin Kamara was going to be suspended. I also didn't know whether or not, I don't have proof of this, but I don't know how hard he worked in the offseason. And it just seemed like as he was playing preseason games, and I wrote this, that yards per carry on the offensive side was not going to be to the liking of the new staff, and that they would have to, by necessity, pass more than they wanted to. And then the last key I had didn't have a lot of eye-opening keys with this team. They have a veteran roster, so I thought a lot of that defense with Dennis Allen would still carry over. But the question would be, what would life be like without Sean Payton? Would there be doubters in the room? Would Dennis Allen hit the ground running, as we will see, because they started the season with so many conference games? So those were my keys. Anything else with the metrics or the personnel that struck your fancy heading into week 1?
I think the quarterback situation was the first and foremost, what that was going to look like, because we all knew that Sean Payton, I think, got a good chunk of creativity out of Taysom Hill. And what would the Andy Dalton experiment look like? And Jameis Winston. I mean, I think there were so many quarterback questions heading into week 1 with this team. To me, that is a very difficult thing to handicap heading into a season. When you're handicapping the Kansas City Chiefs, Patrick Mahomes is going to be there, and that's the guy. Even to a lesser extent, let's say with the Eagles, a lot of people thought, well, Jalen Hurts, there's upside there. We had no idea what the allocation of quarterback play would be with the Saints coming into the season. And the wild card that was Winston, I think, was a very difficult thing to handicap as well. So I think that was the first thing that came to mind. And I think I couldn't get over the hump of, I have no idea who's playing quarterback for this team. So how is it how can I actually sit down with a straight face and handicap the rest of the roster when the most important position was so unsettled, in addition to the coaching switch, which was already going to put the quarterback situation in flux, even if they had an everyday starter? Because you're taking the nucleus of the decision-making out of an offensive mind and putting it into Pete Carmichael, who, let's be honest, has had certainly ups and downs throughout the course of his career. So that was the first thing that came to mind. And then you're right, health, because they are a bit of a veteran-laden team. When I was looking at the numbers this offseason, 21st oldest. So they're on the back nine of the age discrepancy in the NFL, where it's a younger league, obviously, and they're slightly an older team. So how are they going to hold up in a division that, let's be honest, if they had an upside year, if they were able to figure out the quarterback situation, and they kind of almost did this, they could have snuck into the playoffs despite all of this flux. And the two games that I think were going to be the most important games, which it always is, Tampa Bay Bucks. They beat them 7 straight times going into this year, and they lost both games this year. And I think that was the reason why they didn't make the playoffs this season. So going into the year, just with a team that has quarterback issues, it's so hard. And then you throw in a new head coach, and you throw in just overall a division that I think has a lot of volatility, because they're, the Bucks were down. Very, very difficult to get a feel for this team heading into August.
Crazy division for sure. Stat that I kind of looked at because I was all over the place. I actually did not make any future plays with New Orleans.
Yeah, neither did I.
Didn't fade them, didn't do anything there, because I had checks and balances, the veteran roster, the Dennis Allen, how that would play. Sean Payton, with either Taysom Hill or Jameis Winston starting, he was 9-3 the year before. He got the best out of Jameis Winston, which meant that 30 interceptions from the year previous was no longer. And just way too many questions that I had. And it sounds like you did too, if you didn't have any future plays with them. I said, I got to see a full month before. And as it turned out, I had no plays on or against them the first 4 weeks of the season.
Oh, wow. I went back and looked. I bet on them 6 times throughout the course of the season. 2 of them were teasers, traditional Wong teasers from 2.5 to 8.5 and 1.5 to 7.5. I went 1-1 with those teasers. The Saints legs went 1-1. And then I bet them in week 5, week 7, week 9, week 13. All 3 of them as underdogs. The underdog Saints picks went 1-2. And then as a favorite in week 5, I went 1-0. So long story short, I bet on them 6 times, 2 teasers, 3-3. Like it really, and I think that kind of sums up the vibe on them this year. It is fun to go back and look at which teams you bet on more than most, and kind of see which teams you did better with, on or against. But the Saints were, I would say, 50-50 for me last year.
Well, and I think it's an essential part of handicapping.
I agree. Totally agree.
Well, there I am.
There we go. Lost you for a second. You're back.
Yeah. What a day here in Southern California. So the start of the season, week 2, you mentioned Tampa Bay, and I completely agree. I punch out key games. What's the key game? They were leading Tampa Bay, and then Lattimore gets ejected.
Yep, the fight with Mike Evans.
Yeah, and what we've seen, I don't know, 50 times, 100 times, Tom Brady gets on the field a little bit more. He gets in rhythm, and once he gets in rhythm, you can't stop him. And all of a sudden, they take the win. But I think that game was New Orleans all the way until the Lattimore ejection. And that would have such a telling state on what would go on the rest of the year. They lose to Carolina right after that. I think there was either shock or a letdown or a carryover in terms of that.
Yeah.
Suddenly they're 1-2, and then they lose to Minnesota winning all those close games. They're 1-3, and their backs against the wall. Your thoughts at that point?
Well, that was the week I bet them, week 5, Saints -5 against Seattle at home. It was after Winston got hurt. and Andy Dalton was making his second start, and he played well in the game against Minnesota. He threw for a couple touchdowns, 236 yards, or one touchdown. And then the following week facing Seattle, we didn't really know what Seattle was at that point. They had played well. They won their opener, but they were coming into New Orleans, and we weren't really sure about their defense. And, Dalton was average in that game, but it was the running game. Taysom Hill had 3 touchdowns, and that was when we really saw Taysom Hill finally kind of come into his own. He also threw a touchdown. He had 3 touchdowns rushing and also passed for a touchdown as well. And Alvin Kamara was fantastic. That was one of his better receiving games of the year. So I think at that time, and I think it's a good kind of lesson about buying low, selling high in the NFL, the Saints as a favorite at home after their prior few games didn't have a lot of people running to the window, especially with Seattle, being, I would say, an overachieving team through the first 4 weeks and obviously through the rest of the season. So I'm proud of myself that I was able to find that spot in week 5 after they lost 3 in a row, and hopped on them in that game. And I do think it kind of speaks to a handicapping style that is contrarian, right, Ron? Like, that's usually how we win on NFL sides, is we bet favorites after they've lost 3 games in a row and nobody else wants to lay points with them. So yeah, that was an interesting game. I don't remember my mindset heading into the game, but betting that spot and seeing how the schedule played out, it was obvious what I was thinking heading in there.
A little bit of handicapping information there. If coaches think in quartiles, I think handicappers should think in quartiles. I write articles about week 5 each and every year. And the Saints fit a perfect profile. So you and I were in alignment there in terms of 1 and 3. If you go to 1 and 4, I know it's just one game, but 1 and 4 doesn't sound as good as 2 and 3. 2 and 3 means you're right back in the mix when you have 7 playoff teams, especially in that crazy division. 1 and 4 means, you may even change your style when you shouldn't change your style because other things would happen. So that was a very big game, and we didn't know Seattle, like you said, and it was set up for a win, and I agree completely. But then 2 weeks later, they have a short week. They play that Thursday game against Arizona. Hopkins comes back in that game, and the line is Arizona roughly about 2 points. But what we've seen from the Saints at this point is almost a double-digit turnover ratio, a flat sack ratio, a lot of points allowed. When I look back and I see 20, 32, 28, 32, 30, and then 42 to Arizona. This is not the same team that we've seen in the last 3-4 years. So regardless of whether or not it was Arizona and your feelings about Arizona, the feelings for me started to really say, hey, the Saints are basically at best a 50-50 team at this point, and that's what their metrics say. After Arizona, it didn't get any better. It got better against Vegas, but then it got worse in a hurry, and the offense started to sputter after that. Overriding thoughts, second half of the season for you.
Yeah, I think that Arizona game is when I probably was thinking heading into that week, because I was on the Saints plus 2.5 that week, and I was probably thinking that Arizona, maybe with Hopkins coming back, was a little overbaked, but Dalton did not play well in that game, at least early. He got some garbage time late. But the Saints actually had a big, they had a 7-0 lead. Shaheed had a big pass from Dalton in the first quarter. And then from that point on, it was interception, touchdown. It was 3 and outs. It was a lot of Arizona's offense doing a good job. And then you're right. From there, it was kind of a zigzag kind of vibe for them, because they looked completely different the following week. They shut out Vegas, and they were an underdog in that game, Ron, because that in week 8, I teased them up to 7.5. So they were an underdog in that game against the Raiders. And it just kind of shows how the market flipped very briefly right after that Arizona game. Because I would say, after being a home favorite to Seattle in week 5, to go from being a basically pick 'em, 4 weeks later at home against the Raiders, I thought, is a pretty interesting shift in the market after that Arizona game. And then they kind of got bludgeoned a little bit by Baltimore and Pittsburgh. They should beat the Rams. They did. Again, they got bludgeoned by the Niners. And then the next time, actually the last bet I made on the Saints this season was that game against Tampa Bay in the rematch. That was the game where they had a big lead. And I was catching 3 and a hook in that game with New Orleans. And they had a 13-3 lead in the fourth quarter.
Yeah.
And that was when Tom Brady did his thing. And, again, you look at the Saints season, they had won 7 straight against the Bucks in the regular season heading into this year, 2022. They lost both games and they missed the playoffs basically by about a game and a half. Let's call it one full game. So if those two games where they had a lead against Tampa in the first one, they had a lead against Tampa very late in the second one, it's hard to really say what they would have done in the postseason, but I think it's fair to say they win the division if those two very coin flippy results go in the other way. And it really does kind of speak to, despite all the downs that we're talking about, they were right there for most of the year. It's just those 2 games against the Bucks, which clearly were, it was the Bucks' year, I guess, in terms of their coin flips.
Yeah, I think we're going to be on the same page here because I had a question all phrase for you that you probably answered already. But you got a team that, when all was said and done after that terrible start with the point defense, a lot of it caused by turnovers because short fields and so on, they still, if you look at their defensive metrics, to allow just 60% in the NFL these days automatically puts you in the top 3. They ended up with a double-digit negative turnover ratio. It may have been the worst in the NFL, which means since I feel that each turnover is worth 3.5 points, you can pick up a lot of points if you just get to +0, if you just get flat. All that being said, my question to you that you probably answered already is, I particularly think that New Orleans was the best team in the division in 2022, the season we just saw. Do you disagree? Agree?
No, I agree. I think when you talk about roster construction and the key areas that they have spent, they have their most productive players that are Jordan and Lattimore. Now, Lattimore was hurt most of the year, but Cam Jordan had a Pro Bowl year. And I think, unfortunately, he's kind of going to be a trade option because of his, not only what his salary is, but the where his contract is kind of structured right now. It looks like he's going to be a guy that a lot of teams are going to try to trade for. And I think the rest of the defense was so good that it masked a lot of the inconsistencies on offense. Yeah. I mean, I'm looking at their defensive numbers right here on the analytics side. They were top 10 in basically every metric except for run yards per game. Like, that was where they struggled this year. They had really issues in the running game. But the fact that they were able to overcome Marshawn Lattimore being hurt for most of the season and allow the second fewest passing yards per game in the NFL, I think that makes them a very, very tough team, because clearly they overcame I would say Lattimore's their best overall player, top to bottom, being out for the majority of the season, and they still were in contention and they still had really good defensive numbers. So I think the Bucs were a little softer in some of those areas this year. They still had Tom Brady and a great offense, but on the defensive side, I don't think they were as aggressive, and they were dealing with some injuries as well. So I think top to bottom, 1 through 53, yes, New Orleans probably had the best team in the division this year, but the Bucs, just at those top key areas on offense, had a little more savvy to them, and they were able to win those coin flips.
Yeah, it's interesting because it turned out with Kamara that key was unfortunately accurate. They just didn't run the ball that well. Yeah. And their run defense was the real culprit in terms of, I'm so used to them and Tampa being 1-2 in terms of stopping the run. Tampa fell off and Ndamukong Suh was gone, but I don't recall there being major roster issues on Tampa Bay against the run D, but they still allowed 130 per game and 4.5 per carry. That concerned me, but the sack ratio was great, 48-38. Without Sean Payton in the room, I think 38, very average number. It wasn't terrible. It wasn't spectacular like the old Drew Brees days, but you couldn't expect that. But there are a lot of positives to build on with the Saints. One area of concern, and this is where I'm going to talk about free agency, get your thoughts there. 31st in cap space, I believe, as we speak, with a negative, $33 million in the hole. They're going to have to restructure and cut a lot. What do you do? How do you kind of surgically work this roster?
It's going to be a couple trades. It's going to be a couple cuts. I think from what I'm reading here, Winston probably gone. And then Michael Thomas, of course, is going to be gone. They'll save a few million there. And then you look at Cam Jordan. I mean, he accounts for 11% of their salary cap right now. And if they can get and he's still a very productive player. That's why I think he's a good trade candidate, because there is someone who will want to take on his $14 million salary for next year because he's a Pro Bowler. But I think because of the way the Saints roster is constructed, it doesn't make sense for them to keep him because they have a little more depth at that position. And again, he is the highest paid player on the team. Very rarely is the highest paid player in terms of cap percentage allocation a non-quarterback. So I think that makes them a little handcuffed with how they can operate. Now, it's good that they're not paying one of those top premier quarterbacks. I don't know what they're going to do with that position. I guess maybe Dalton's the guy that comes back, but I don't know if that's what they want. I don't know if they want to build for the future. And I think that's a question that needs to be answered. But it's obvious to me that Cameron Jordan is probably going to be a trade candidate because they want 11% of their allocation back that they can use elsewhere, because you're right. They are kind of in a difficult position, salary cap wise heading into this offseason.
Do you know offhand what Kamara's contract is? Is he on danger at all?
He is $9 million next year. He's about 7% of the cap. He's not on the list of cut candidates that the NBC analyst Kyle Dvorak posted. He posted an article on the NBC Sports site last week. He's the guy that covers the Saints for them. He did not list Kamara as a cap casualty, so to say. It looks like it's Pete, Winston, and Thomas, I think, that are going to be the three guys that would get cut. I think Kamara proved his worth. I mean, I think $9 million for him is probably fair, but I could see a team being aggressive maybe and looking to trade for him. But I don't think he is a free agent until 2024. Let me confirm that here. They have a potential out next year. But, he signed a $75 million contract 3 years ago. So he is going to be, one more year basically, where I think they're committed to Kamara and then probably out in 2024.
Okay. I was okay with the way let's just say the potential of the wide receiver core going into this past year. They had Michael Thomas, and he started fast and then he got hurt again. They had Jarvis Landry, who has just those sure hands and works the routes perfectly. And then they had Chris Olave. It's set up nicely, but now we're looking at a divorce of one or two of those. Do you think they go wide receiver relatively early in this next draft?
Well, they really like Rashid Shaheed. Him and Olave combined for about 900 snaps this year. So they've got two guys from that rookie class that I think are capable. And I would say you always need depth at that position. But if you compare Landry with the two youngsters, I think that's serviceable this year. I really think the quarterback situation for New Orleans I don't think you can go into the season with, let's say they cut Winston, let's say it's Dalton and Hill. I don't think that's going to cut it. I would say that position needs to be upgraded. Maybe Jimmy Garoppolo is a good option. Maybe they just say, listen, we need a guy that can offer a little bit more upside than Andy Dalton, but we also don't want to break the bank and go after a guy like Carr or Lamar Jackson or even trade for Aaron Rodgers. But he's not staying in the NFC, right? So I would say the quarterback position needs to be the focus here, because I don't think there's a long-term plan right now. Taysom Hill's not a long-term solution, and neither is Andy Dalton. So what's your 5-year plan for the most important position on your team? And it would be a shame if the same questions that we had going into last season are also the same questions we have going into this season. To me, that doesn't show a lot of progress with an organization, right?
Well, you mentioned what's their 5-year plan, and my first reaction to that was, have they ever had a 5-year plan? Because they seem to trade so crazily in every draft that it's really, can we go over the hump this year? We know we're a good to great team with Drew Brees. Can we win it all? And that window is passed, and now they have to, in my opinion, come up with the 5-year plan. So I have two more questions for you, and the first one, again, centers on Dennis Allen. How far, in your opinion, can a coach like Dennis Allen take them? Is there a ceiling?
I think he's a stopgap, right? I think he was a comfortable choice in a transitionary period for this franchise. When you move on from a guy like Sean Payton, let's be honest, we saw it with the Giants. We've seen it with other I would say franchises that had success and then made some bad decisions and lost some of that luster. And how was the uptick? Like, how do you chart the bottom of the chart and then get it back into an uptrend? Brian Daboll's the answer, right? I don't know if they have that with Dennis Allen. Like, if I was going to chart out where we are in a 10, 15-year period with the Saints, we're definitely past the peak, and I think we're still trending down. And I don't think we've reached the bottom yet. And unfortunately, the bottom in the NFL is ugly. Heads will roll. The league stands for not for long for a reason. And unfortunately, I do think Dennis Allen is kind of the scapegoat of that, because you go from Peyton, and then if Dennis Allen isn't able to find lightning in a bottle with this, let's call it hodgepodge roster construction of overpriced defensive free agents and not a lot of stability at quarterback, well, Dennis Allen's the obvious choice for who gets blamed for that. And I don't know what the next step is, but I would say a young mind with a great offensive scheme that can kind of revitalize a team that, let's be honest, they play in a division that is going to be up for grabs. I think Tampa Bay's in transition. Carolina doesn't have a quarterback situation. Atlanta might be the best team in this division next year. So especially if they go get Lamar Jackson. So I think Dennis Allen is unfortunately going to be the first person likely to feel the wrath of a downtrending team that is used to having some success.
So that's a perfect transition to the final question that I had, and really is, this division is up for grabs. And I could make a case for New Orleans as much as any of the other teams. It's not going to take much in terms of being first or being fourth. So, and I agree with you about Dennis Allen. If he goes 7-10 again in this division, I think they may want to opt somewhere else because they realize there's not a huge upside. But if you had to pick the division right now, you're saying that maybe Atlanta would be your first choice?
Atlanta 1, New Orleans 2, Tampa 3, Carolina. Maybe Tampa, Carolina 3, 4. I don't know Tampa, Carolina right now. Obviously, Tampa, there's going to be, first of all, I wasn't very high on the rest of Tampa's, construction outside of Tom Brady. Rising tide lifts all boats with Brady. I think Carolina has upside, but again, it goes back to the same conversation we had with New Orleans last year. No idea who the starting quarterback is. They might go get someone in this draft that might change my opinion. If they go get an Anthony Richardson and they bring him in and they love him, I might say that Carolina has a little more upside, but I don't trust Anthony Richardson that much right now either. Maybe they trade up and they want to go get Bryce Young. I don't know how aggressive David Tepper is going to be with a lot of the I guess, assets that Carolina has at their disposal. I think they have 2 first-round picks. I might be wrong about that, though. But to me, Atlanta has the most stability. You have a head coach, Arthur Smith, that I think is starting to figure out how to be a head coach in the NFL. And you have a defense that showed a little bit more fight than I thought maybe the numbers indicated last year. And then, oh, by the way, I think he's the most suitable landing spot for Lamar Jackson based off the system that Atlanta ran last year with Marcus Mariota and Desmond Ridder. If you just drop Lamar Jackson into that offense, I would have been fascinated to see what Arthur Smith and some of those weapons could have been able to accomplish last year. So I think if I had to make a bet here in, let's call it March, where the offseason is so unsettled, I think this division does have volatility to the upside for a team like Atlanta if they can get that quarterback in tow. If they go get Lamar Jackson, they jump to the favorite in the division overnight. So I think that's why Atlanta would be the one bet I would maybe consider at this point, but we're very early on in the process.
Sure. Very. It's fascinating as we wrap this up in that any one of these teams could make the right moves to win the division in 2023. Yep. The problem I would have is, what if they make the right move to win the division in 2023, but sacrifice their future in order to do it? A trade for Lamar Jackson might involve draft capital for years to come and maybe a couple of players. If New Orleans keeps on their path of drafting 4, 5, 6 players a year to try to win with that veteran defense, does that mean that they win this year? Yeah, they could easily win, but then they're sacrificing their future. Tampa Bay might have to rebuild. Carolina's, been a quarterback away for a number of years. So it's just fascinating to balance. How much do you want to go for it in 2023 versus how much do you want to sustain all the way through for the next 4, 5, 6 years in an NFL that's changing year to year. Any final thoughts before we wrap this up? With
Well,
New
I
Orleans?
appreciate you having me on, Ron. Honestly, I think these discussions, I get asked to come on a lot of shows and give out picks, but I think the discussions that we have behind the scenes, and this one being televised, which is great. I think this is how you formulate your foundational opinions for teams heading into the year. And my advice to people watching this that want to aspire to do this long term for a living, for a hobby, whatever, only 5% of what we do is actually making picks. I think this is a 95% exercise with having critical conversations about teams, trying to talk through situations. And I think, again, that's why I appreciate you having me on. I think you're one of the best at doing this. And this is a very, very important part of the NFL process. It's not just looking at your roster in August and seeing what you can bet on. It's having some kind of opinion on the team before that spot where you could say, did they grow? Did they regress? What's the market sentiment on a team compared to what it was in March? And that's why I think this is these conversations are very important for young handicappers to have about these teams. It gives you the depth that you need when you get into the season. You don't have to think about it. It's like a reaction. Well, this is how I feel. And my feeling has evolved since then. And then the numbers back it up. So I thank you for having me on, because it's been a really fun convo.
I thank you for being on, and you just said, everything you said is just in a nutshell that people should understand. I don't want to overreact week 3 to what happened in week 2. I want to have already worked on that in July and August, had these conversations, networked. I always encourage people to write and to speak out loud for clarity and so on. I'm glad we were able to hook up. I hope, whether it be the draft or in the upcoming season and so on. Really enjoyed this conversation.